Hello, everyone. Welcome. So excited to have you all here. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 510th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Carlos Basualdo, Joan Simon, Robert Storr, and Constance Lewallen. We are also thrilled to welcome poet Bianca Stone here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions in just a moment. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, along with thoughtful, social, and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we do need your support, and your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and all of our operations here at the Rail. So please check the chat for more information and links to donate. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Carlos Basualdo is the Keith L. and Katherine Sachs Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where he oversees the Department of Contemporary Art. He was the lead organizer of Bruce Nauman Topological Gardens at the 2009 Venice Biennale, where it was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. Joan Simon is a writer, curator, and arts administrator who works independently for museums, foundations, and media organizations in the US and Europe. She is a contributing editor at Art in America and served as general editor for the exhibition catalog and catalog raison of Bruce Nauman 1994. Robert Storr, preeminent art critic, curator, artist, and educator, is the former dean of Yale School of Art and senior curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. He was the first American to serve as visual arts director of the Venice Biennale. And our host, Constance Lewallen, is adjunct curator at the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. She is the co-author with Dor Bowen of Bruce Nauman Spatial Encounters, published by UC Press. She is also an editor at large here at the Brooklyn Rail. And thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the mic over to you, Constance.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thank you, Brooklyn Rail and Fong, for this amazing series. And I'm just going to jump right in. I thought we'd start with talking about the show that's in Venice that Carlos is the co-curator of. I know most of you might not have seen that, although it's going to be up through into November, right, Carlos? And Carlos?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, are you there? And what I thought we would do is just start with some of the visuals. Most of the works in the show have been shown before, almost all of them, not all of them, but most of you will not have seen the show in Venice, although I'm hoping to go there in May and see it in person because there's, it's an immersive experience, as is the show in New York. And so to see it on slide form is just not seeing it the right way. But in any case, the title of the exhibition, Contrapposto Studies, obviously features that series, which he began, I think, in 2010, and has been shown over those years in various combinations and permutations. And in your case, you decided to build the entire show around that series, but a lot of other work is included that you feel relates to that series. You said in many things I've read that you decided to focus the exhibition on performance and sound. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I think, Connie, one thing to keep in mind is that the beginning of the show was a joint acquisition that Philadelphia did with the Pinot collection of Contrapposto Studies 1 to 7. And the works were shown in Philadelphia. And the goal was to present them in Venice. And in Venice, we were given the Punta de la Dogana. It's a much larger space, so we decided to build the show around that work, right? Following a logic that is not dissimilar to what we did in 2009. So looking at different works in Bruce's production that somehow lead to the construction of the Contrapposto style.
Yes, before we go further, let me just say that Rob and Joan, like myself, probably haven't seen the show, but you're familiar with the work. And please interject, ask questions, make comments as we go along. Okay. As we know, this recent series, Contrapposto Studies, was based on a very early piece that he did in 1968 of video called Walk with Contrapposto, which he built a corridor for. And he walked up and down the corridor for, I think, almost an hour with his hands behind his head. And yet, even though Nauman has often gone to earlier works and found inspiration or ways he could update them in certain ways, this is the first time he really took a piece completely as it was and used that. Is that correct?
It's one of his first videos, Connie. Yes, absolutely, yes. Before that, he had shot himself in film format, doing performances in the studio. But for work with Contrapposto, he used a different technology.
And also, he built that corridor for the video. He didn't build it as a piece, a standalone piece.
That's right. Originally it was built for the video, yes.
Right, and then it was shown as a sculptural installation at the Anti-Illusion show at the Whitney. And that was the first time it was, and that actually was the beginning of the entire series of corridors, which of course occupied him for many years subsequently.
That's right, that's right.
When I did the early show of his early work, A Rose Has No Teeth, we included that corridor as the last piece in that show. And interestingly enough, people were allowed to enter it, but nobody ever did. I think we're so used to not being able to interact physically with the artworks that, they didn't even consider going in there. But anyway, so I think that what interested him in doing this, revisiting this work, is that he had now all kinds of new technology in which he could develop the work in many ways that he couldn't have obviously in the beginning. Let's see. And I also want to make note of the fact that this is a show that has almost no objects in it. It's based on sound, performance, and the studio, are three major touchstones for Nauman in all of his work. So as we enter, we're looking at the first, are we looking at the first gallery here?
I think the first gallery is the slide before, Connie. It's you actually see an empty space. That's right.
It's the sound piece.
And it's a sound piece. It's for beginners instructed piano. So you listen to the piano. At the show opened in May, and it was, it was delayed because of the pandemic. And at the time when we opened the show in May, this same work was playing in a sottoportico, one of the passages that you go through when accessing the piazzetta where Punta de la Dogana is. So let's say the visitor comes, go through a little tunnel and listens to this sound that they don't know what it is. There's no labels, nothing. Then they get into the space. It's the same sound and they recognize the sound, and then they can identify it as an artwork.
I see. I was going to ask you why you decided to start with that sound piece, and now I know.
Yes, it's I wanted to somewhat delay the recognition, the moment of recognition. I think that's something that happens in Bruce's work very often, that you are in front of something that you don't have a name with, you don't know how to account for, and I wanted to see if we could do that, by playing with the way in which the works were distributed in the space.
Later on, you show another version of this piece, which is a video version, in a further gallery. And
right.
yet there are two videos that are the same, but they're not in sync.
That's
And
right.
I've noted that not in sync is something that Nauman is interested in. I mean, there's early on, and most of you might not even know this piece, but he did a video that was called Sound Effects for Manipulating the T-Bar. And the T-bar was another video, and they're shown concurrently, but the sound effects don't go with what you're seeing on the screen. So I think he enjoys that disjunction or that out of sync aspect. Also lip sync, of course. Rob, you have anything you want to add at this point?
Not at this point, no, thank you.
How about you, Joan?
You're back on. Everything seemed frozen for a bit.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I could only see myself live on the little postage stamp, but everybody else was,
Technicolor.
yeah. Stop motion.
And Joan, you haven't seen the Venice show yet, have you?
No, I've seen just about all of the works in the Venice show, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in the fall when it will be on view simultaneously with the show at Pirelli Hangar by Coca in Milan.
Right. Let's go to the next image.
So the next image is the Contrapposto Studies 1 to 7, and those are the first two screens, the 1 and 2. There's single figures in the screen, positive and negative, Connie, and that takes you to the second room where you have the rest of you have from 3 to 7. And in both cases, there are these two very large rooms. Yesterday, when we were having an initial conversation, you asked me about the sizes of the images, and we tried to reproduce as much as we could the installation in Philadelphia, where Bruce basically sized the works himself, and we did some smaller adjustments, in which we work with Bruce and his technicians, but basically the configuration replicates what we did in Philadelphia, what we had done in Philadelphia.
Maybe you should go to the next slide now. Yeah. So this is a very long room, I'm assuming.
That's right, yes.
And you are surrounded on either side with reverses and changes in color and black and white. And we're not yet at the point where you're using 3D, are we?
No, these early works didn't use, these early contrappostos didn't use 3D. 3D came at the very end of the whole series, yeah.
Right, okay, let's go along with the slides.
And this is a performance room. So you move out of those two first rooms and you enter a room where there's performances, and the performances are a selection of 3 performances that are being played more or less continuously by a group of performers that are basically trained to do them.
I think we're looking at wall floor positions right now. Yeah, and they reproduced that also in the retrospective at MoMA.
Yeah, this is bouncing in the corners, low angle walk, stamping in the studio. I mean, we didn't have floor to wall positions.
Oh, but I'm talking about the performers.
Yes.
In the beginning, when Bruce actually did perform himself a couple of times at Davis when he was still in school, and then a couple of times after with Meredith Monk and Judy Nauman at the Whitney show, Anti-Illusion, and then again later at the Santa Barbara Arts Festival with Richard Serra and Meredith Monk. But, he said at one point, I read that, he was interested in performance, but he just didn't have many opportunities to actually do performance. And so then he started giving instructions, especially if he had a show in Europe and he wasn't going to travel there. He would send instructions for dancers or performers to perform the works that he describes. So performance has always been very key to Nauman, of course, his body, but also other people's bodies.
And in this case, we work more or less like that. And, we shot the performers doing their work and we send it to Bruce. And he provided us with comments, and we worked like that also in 2009. So it was the same methodology.
Let's look at the next image or two.
So that's the old contrapposto, 68.
Right. Why did you put this why didn't you put this at the beginning?
Because there's not the show is not organized chronologically. It's a sort of a series of ritornellos, like musical ritornellos, in which chronology is constantly suggested, but at the same time contradicted. And I think that gives a better sense of the way in which the work doesn't really follow the linear logic, but it sort of comes back upon itself in each successive development. So I wanted to have the viewer basically going back and forth mentally and physically while experiencing the show.
Carlos, I have a question. I'm sure you considered it when you were making this show. The contrapposto walk, as you know, appeared in a film previously, walking around the perimeter of a square in an exaggerated manner. Did you consider showing the film as well as the walk in the corridor? Because you do see very distinctly the contrapposto walk in that.
No, I wanted to keep it tied to the contrapposto just to reinforce the connection, because I think that, Joan, what I was curious about is this idea that Bruce, the logic of the work, there's a certain sort of circularity to it, but he had never declared, like, manifestly going back to an earlier work to redo it, and
Right.
for me, I wanted to recover the specificity of that intention.
It's a great idea. Yeah, I get it. Thanks.
Yeah, he didn't really use video until that winter he spent in New York and had access to a video camera for the first time, 1969. Before that, it was film, which he used a film camera that he borrowed from the San Francisco Art Institute, where he was part-time teacher. But he saw the advantage of video very soon after he could edit it himself, and it could be longer and so forth. Carlos, are any of these projections of contrapposto studies larger than they've been shown before?
That's a very good question. I think that maybe the 1 and 2 are slightly larger. I think that we decided to enlarge 1 and 2 a little bit. So I would say that not, they were not. They are very much along the lines of the dimensions that were shown in Philadelphia, but there were some slight adaptations to the space, Connie. Yes.
But nothing major.
No, nothing major.
Okay, let's continue with the images. What are we looking at here?
Those are the 2 models of the Philadelphia show that Bruce,
Right.
First, I mean, we always, that's also the way in which I've been working with him since 2009, is that I send him the maquettes, and then, I visit and we discuss the maquettes that end up being inhabited by the cats. And in this case, he sort of decided to make this to show this in New York at Angela Waters Gallery. It was a surprise to me because I thought that they were actually a maquette, but I think it does have to do with the way in which he moved from the corridors to the scale models, of tunnels and so forth. So, it was really interesting, and that that's how they exist. They're very interesting objects, I would say, and some of the few exceptions to the rule, Connie, of not having objects in the show.
Right, exception. Well, steel channel piece, right?
That's right.
The other exception. I can't really tell what I'm seeing here.
This is, again, it's an empty room. It's at the top of the little tower, the Torino of, so you have this beautiful view of Venice, and what you hear is for children, which is another sound piece.
Yes, yes.
And it's very, it's quite loud. So you can almost hear it even if you go to the balcony.
Oh, okay.
And you can hear it from below. So as you go, these 2 works, the models and the sound piece are in the Torino, in the tower. So the space has a strange circulation. It's organized in 2 floors, but the tower is adjacent to those 2 floors.
Oh, I see. Let's see the next image.
So then it's going back to that room, so you get a sense of the flow, and now it moves to steel channel piece,
And let's go to that piece then.
which, you know, it's of course an earlier piece, but it was only restored the last couple of years. I mean, it belongs to the Sonaven collection. It was not working, and it had been on display at Madre in Naples for many years, you know, completely silent. And then the work went to a show in Malaga, a Nauman show in Malaga, and Antonio, the Sonaven collection, restored the work, and so we were very lucky that now it's fully functional, and it's quite extraordinary.
Well, for people who don't know, the piece called Steel Channel Piece has a voice recording of Nauman intoning anagrams of all of those works, and so that sometimes the works are recognizable as English works, but other words rather, but otherwise they're just sort of nonsense. But that interest in language has really permeated his work from day one. What was I going to say? Oh yes, that language for him is another expression of his interest in communicating and not communicating at the same time, at that tension.
That's right. And this is in the center of the space. It's a space called a gallery called the Cube. And so it's quite large, but it's a work that is belongs to LACMA and to the Pinot collection. It has been shown in Los Angeles as well as in Venice.
Are there pieces in the show that have never been shown in Europe before?
Yes, there are several. I think that I will tell you about them as we move along.
Okay, let's move along.
So those are different views of the cube.
Right.
You can look at the cube from both levels, so not only from ground level but from the first floor as well.
Let's continue.
And then you move into the 3D pieces. There's two rooms, and that you asked me also about Bruce's intervention, and you know, you see that here the image is projected on a slanted wall, and that was Bruce's preference.
Ah.
You know, and so this is the first 3D piece, and it's quite. He's working on contrapposto, and it's called contrapposto split. You have to wear glasses to look at it, and you know the lightning. It's very bright, and you see his face for the first time in the series, which is, I think, quite shocking, really.
Right. In many of his earlier works, his face is cut off purposefully. Excuse me for a minute. I have to get a glass of water, but you continue, Carlos.
Yes, I think that, you know, the challenge here was that originally, you know, this is the second 3D, and I would say it's the last work related to the Contrapposto series. Although he's not walking in Contrapposto, properly speaking, he's walking a line. Originally, Bruce didn't want these 3Ds one after the other. You know, the equipment of 3D is also quite bulky and noisy, but there was no other way to install them. So ultimately, right now, you see them one after the other. And for me, this was shown in New York, but had never been shown in Europe. And it's quite dramatic, you know. I mean, the extended arms and the tentative figure. He seems to be stumbling upon himself and falling at times. I would say it's very strong.
I've always noted how Nauman is often the protagonist of his own work, but you never really come away knowing anything about Nauman except for how he looks.
That's right. You can see more in the whole Contrapposto series, you perceive a number of things that are related to his, you know, his body and what he has been gone through in the last years. You know, so we can talk about it later.
Yeah, yeah, both illness, but also just aging, normal aging.
That's right.
So his body is thicker, not as supple, and so forth. Okay.
Right. And in this work, he is walking barefoot, which is
Oh, yeah, another difference.
Yeah.
But the same white shirt and black pants.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead.
And then you go upstairs to the diagonal sound wall, which this is a Panza. I mean, it belongs to the Panza collection. So what it means is that it was recreated for this installation. And in this case, yes, we made samples of the materials and send them to Bruce, and then we work with Bruce on the finishing, and it was, quite an extensive conversation.
It's interesting how sound and lack thereof are two sides of the coin that often engage him.
In this, the whole installation is very noisy. So when you get to this piece, it really starts sucking out the noise. It's a very noticeable effect, for those of us, I mean, at the beginning, I was wondering, does this work? I mean, does it absorb sound? And it really, really does. It's very, very clear.
Okay, thank you. What is
Yes.
this name of this?
This is acoustic wedge, and originally the acoustic wedge is only one section. Basically, it's like a triangle, let's say, but Bruce mirrored it, so it created a new piece. So this is a new work. It's called acoustic wedge mirror, and it can be accessed from both sides. It's a form of corridor, Connie. I mean, it's a corridor. The other is a corridor as well, and what contrapposto studies create a kind of virtual corridor. So there's a lot of that feeling of walking in a corridor in the show.
And also it's a kind of refuge, as you say, from the noise that you've been hearing throughout so far.
Yes,
now,
and light. These are the spaces that are lit.
Uh-huh.
And if you look at the drawing for this work, you will see the unusual configuration of an X, and that will be seen in the show at Speroni Westwater in Making His Mark.
Yeah, that's
totally right.
That's a good observation. And now the next one, please.
So then you move on to mapping, to a version of Mapping the Studio that is called, it's a test tape, a chance on cage. So it's a single channel projection. Those are just two views of the screen, but it's a single channel.
So this is I was just going to say that this was shown a number of years ago, and it's the first time we really we could enter into a studio to an extent. I mean, these images were made with surveillance cameras over a period of weeks or months, but let's continue to the next.
And these are two editions, basically. I mean, the one, well, there's a drawing, Violence, Violence, Silence, that belongs to the Pinot collection that you see on the far wall. And then what we're showing is the soundtrack from the first violin. And that was made as an edition relatively recently. I mean, it's originally from '69. And with the person who made the edition, we work on the turntables, on basically making it possible for the work to be shown in an exhibition context. The interesting thing is that there's two turntables, right, that play in both sides of the record. And one is black and the other is white. So there is this relationship between positive and negative in the turntables. Right?
That's good. That's great.
And then the first sound piece, which is Footsteps, which is exists as an object, is in the first between. And I think Joan or you, Connie, can tell us more about that. It's a very interesting work. It was done for Bill Copley's magazine, right?
Right. Yeah, I forget the name of that magazine. Shit Can Happen or something like that. Yeah. Joan, do you want to talk about that?
About which one? Footsteps?
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the few objects that Carlos included in the show. I mean, It really is a piece of evidence, an instruction, a description of the footsteps you would hear, but it's a piece of paper. printed piece of paper.
And
Right.
it has wrapped around the paper, Joan, has the tape is wrapped around the paper.
Right.
So
And it
if you're going to play it, you have to destroy the piece.
But it also relates to the tape used, the audio tape used in the Conrad Fisher piece
Yes.
about the 6 sound problems that are spooled around the pencil in a chair and to a reel-to-reel tape recorder. I mean, the interesting thing is, one of the interesting things is Nauman using the medium as the material, as the object, and as the sound generator. So it's not one thing, and ultimately they're both sculptures, and he's a sculptor.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the work, the instructions for the display of the work are they coincide with the 6 problems for Conrad Fisher. So it anticipates that work, just by a few months. And
Right.
the difference is that you know that you have just that tiny piece of tape that is trapped around the car.
It's like his using string or rope or other ordinary materials to make a form.
Can I pick up quickly on something that Joan said?
Yeah,
Am I
please.
audible or not? She said ultimately he's a sculptor, and I think that's really important to stress. And I think it's really a lot of what the contrapposto pieces are about. He's using different means, but he's actually doing very classical problems in sculpture. And contrapposto is a way to create a sense of 3-dimensionality and even of movement in a static piece of stone or a static piece of bronze. He has now taken a whole new technology and applied it to that problem, and then brought it to the home of Renaissance sculpture to show that what is possible in contemporary means. And that is the radicality of his work in many ways, is that he is actually totally cognizant of the long traditions that got stuck and couldn't be dislodged, and he has dislodged them all practically.
So that is very key what Rob just said, because I think that one thing not to lose sight of is that contrapposto is a very key moment. The introduction of contrapposto in the history of Greek art is a completely key moment because it happens around the 5th century before Christ, and then you move from a static representation of a figure to a dynamic representation of a figure. And the references to art history seem to be very, very clear, in this recent work, and to the history of sculpture specifically. So I agree. I mean, the use of 3D, 3D is a way of producing.
But I will say also that
Oh, we're frozen.
I will say also that a lot of younger people only know digital media, so they're not going to get the older stuff. They're not going to get the references because they don't know the traditions of sculpture, which it is pushing off from or references in some way. So this is a wonderful show to sort of flip. I mean, he does this a lot in his work, where he flips something that you've seen one way and then you see it another. And that's even in the things that are in New York. It's in his green piece with the horses and so on. But he's actually doing that with tradition. You have audiences that know one half of it, and there are audiences that know the other half of it, and Bruce knows both halves and makes them work dialectically back and forth as sculpture, as a physical experience.
And he's always interested in utilizing new technology, but only for a purpose, not for itself. He's not interested in the technology for technology's sake. But like even with holograms, remember the studies for holograms, which he did a few pieces and then he didn't, because I think he thought he had explored what was possible and that was it, and he moved on. Do we have another image?
Then you move to 2 videos of performances, and those are, very Elke and Tony. Elke allowing the floor to rise, and Tony sinking in the floor. They're sort of psychological performances. The reason why I included them was just to remind the audience that performance in Bruce is just not only physical. There's always a psychological component that is absolutely key of the entire work, right? So it happens in your mind as much as it happens in your body.
This is an interesting piece in Bruce's work. It was not included in the first retrospective when it was shown in California, but it was made in New York and was shown at the Whitney for the first time. And it's the first time he's not using himself as the performer and as the object and as the subject of the study. Elka and Tony, both artists, both were performers in a theater group that Marcia Tucker had founded, and Marcia introduced these two people to Bruce, and it was shot in New York.
Oh, that's interesting. And now, the next slide, please.
That's the Tony.
Right. And the next one.
And that's sound breaking wall.
Right.
Which to me, I was like super happy to be able to, do this work because it belongs to the Panza collection, but I don't think it was ever really reconstructed in a way that was satisfactory for Bruce, and I mean, I wish Bruce would come. He was going to come to Venice in April, and he's not going to be able to because the piece is just extraordinary. It's impossible to describe. But there's a sound of him breathing and then pounding the walls, and you can feel the pounding in your body. And that was done with technology. Now we have the kind of speakers that are able to really convey that sensation precisely,
Well, it's a much later iteration of an earlier piece in a way, of Get Out of My Mind, Get Out of This Room, which is, kind of puts the viewer at, makes the viewer very anxious or, kind of having a very strong response. They want to get out, why are they wanting to get out? So in this case, you're hearing Bruce, what is he, laughing and pounding and, making noises, and you're not sure where they're coming from. It's very disorienting.
That's right. That's exactly right. And then Nature Mort, which was shown again for the first time in Europe, and that's, this 3D exploration of the studio, which is very eerie because, of course, it's you basically, traversing this sort of shell that looks like a residue, something a leftover most, right? And you encounter different words that you might be able to identify. You encounter things that seem to have been used just recently. It's very eerie.
Sorry for that sound. Yes, I mean, it's the first time, well, actually, the viewer gets to maneuver around the studio with the help of iPads, right? So you can actually explore the studio sort of yourself, and you can see aspects of old works and pieces of, debris. And I mean, the studio is kind of a mess, but I think that's how Nauman likes to work.
And Connie, it's interesting how it was made because it was, he scanned, there's a section of the studio that was used almost like a set. And there were certain objects that were placed very deliberately there. And then it was scanned in sections and then stitched together digitally. So the production is also quite homemade and quite laborious in a way. Again, to what Rob was saying about sculpture, it's very clearly constructed. It's almost like a virtual three-dimensional bricolage.
Also, he's allowed the viewer to manipulate the screen to go into, under, around, come up from above an object. It's not a static view. And in the gallery, the person who's manipulating it can see it on the iPad, but others in the room can see it as wall-sized projections.
And the studio, it always comes back to the studio, the very early pieces of walking in the studio, performing in the studio, famous statement of what I do in my studio is art. So I like the way that kind of circles back the studio as the site of creativity and his work.
I think you also need to see this as a performance. He held the scanner in his hand, he moved around the studio, ducking under things, going above things. And for each shot, he not only saw it through the lens, but performed it.
Now, I don't want to use all the time for Venice. I think we should move on to the show, His Mark, which is currently on view.
And that we're finishing, Connie. I mean, there was just one more image that
Oh,
I can
okay,
speak
sorry.
about it. It's okay. It's
No.
Walk In, Walk Out, which
Okay.
is, I mean, it's just important because it started as a test. Bruce was, you know, trying different sizes for the projection. This is for the show at Angela Westwater. And it's very strange because he looked at the test and he decided to make it into an edition and a work. You almost get the feeling of Bruce coming into the space and going out. And that is the last work of the show. And then you have to go down a set of stairs that take you back to Contrapposto. So that's, in a way, you end where you begin, and there's a certain circularity of the exhibition. That's all.
Well, I can't wait to see the show.
It looks as powerful as it did in Philadelphia, Carlos. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now, as I said, we should move on to the current show that is going to be up through Sunday, I believe, at Speroni Westwater, called His Mark, dated 2021. And again, I haven't seen this, but I have seen images. But I know that being in this show is quite different from looking at it this way. I mean, it surrounds you. It's kind of, one of the people I know who saw it said it was somewhat overwhelming, and not in a bad way, but it just consumes you. And it's all 3D, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and you've seen it, Joan, you said a couple of times.
Yes, I did just about a week ago. I think before we talk about it, we should encourage everybody who's watching today to see the show before it closes on March 12th, because we're seeing two-dimensional images on the screen. And truly, when you're in the space, he's not only a sculptor, but almost every element of his thinking as a sculptor comes through. It's also unlike any Hollywood 3D film, the famous James Cameron avatars. Actually, the third one is coming out in this December 22. I have a hard time watching 3D in a movie theater, and I was surprised that I was totally entranced and mesmerized by these. I think partly it's because they're very slow. I think partly the sculpture effect is that it brings the image out to you when you're in, not this room, but the next one we see where the pair is at an angle. You feel like the image is coming out to your shoulder. And you see him as a sculptor, realizing that everything he does is happening in space. He's performing this gesture. It's conceptual, it's invisible. He, in the same way he made visible invisible spaces before. He's a craftsman, a draftsman, but he's not drawing with ink or any other tangible thing. His fingers are tracing the lines, generating the lines which are invisible.
Right.
And his sense of humor is there too, because he's drawing it on a table that's filled with marks.
Right.
That was used in a post office. The other thing is the inspiration for this. There's often a subtext of Nauman's work of what has captured his attention and made him think about things anew. And the source for this was a catalog to a Canadian exhibition that was given to Bruce by his grandson, Milo. And the exhibition was called Reservation X, The Power of Place, which could also be used as the title for this show. The whole idea of his mark, I mean, whose mark is this? Clearly it's Nauman's, but you can't see it. The original mark X signed documents when the chief of an indigenous Canadian tribe who was representing North American and Canadian surrendered land on a very controversial, not exchange, surrender. So that's underlying the prompt. The other thing that's so surprising about this is I think part of the reason I'm mesmerized with these is that it doesn't have the speed or the punch of Hollywood 3D. It comes at you very slowly, almost as if bread is rising. You don't see the increments of the growth, but it comes out very gently. And as I said, it will come out to your shoulder, almost touch you, which is very, very, it's actually comforting kind of feeling rather than a frightening one. I'm often very queasy in a movie theater with 3D.
Joan, I think that it's interesting to mention that both the second 3D, Walking a Line, and all these works were shot with iPhones. I mean, and Bruce shot them himself with Bruce Hamilton.
Well, I think I'm going to interject one point, which is also surprising about this. The previous 3D ones were shot with Hollywood equipment and Hollywood crews that he brought to New Mexico. This particular one was shot by Bruce Hamilton, his longtime partner in figuring out video and problems and technical problems. It was shot with 2 iPhones that are merged. And I would say when you first walk into the gallery, before you have put on the 3D glasses, what you will see on the wall is sort of a double image. You'll see 2 rings on his hand. And when you put the glasses on, they consolidate. So I think it's a really interesting step to go from using very expensive high-level production to go back into the studio, work intimately with Bruce Hamilton to create his own 3D.
Let's look at some of the other images in the show. Yeah.
What Joan just said is consistent with another aspect of Bruce's work, which is that he has numbers of times cut things away, gone back to basics, and made a point of it, so that when he did Setting a Good Corner, it was made in the context where there was all of this fantastical video coming out by lots of artists using all the technology they could muster, and he had a set camera, just walked into and out of the shot. That was it. But the point was to make something right, to do it right, and what he was doing right was an ordinary task on the ranch. But he was using modern technology to make the point about doing things even with modern technology that are unfancy.
I'd also add to Rob's point that, and also to Carlos's Venice show, this is also like a topographic view. And as in many other Nauman works, you will see an image right reading, upside down, flopped, flipped. But the transitions are very, very, very smooth. And so the desktop will look like an urban grid or a plain field or a map, but it's just a wooden beat up tabletop.
Yeah, there is a profound, to the point of both John and Rob, I mean, there's an ethics in the way in which Bruce uses whatever medium he approaches, right? I mean, and there's never, there's never a sense of excess. There's always a sense of using exactly what's needed to attain a certain effect without nothing, with no mannerisms whatsoever.
It also reminded me of his earlier sleight of hand videos, where the idea is to really have a sustained look at what's happening and to see if you can see the moment where a change happens, where the trick is done, which was done in a very slowed way. And I think part of the reason it's comfortable to watch this is the steadiness and the slowness of the image, and also the change of point of view. The camera moves over, around, to the side, but it's all very seamless, and you hardly know that the camera has moved or that the image has changed until you realize which hand is wearing the rings.
Let's move to a couple of other images.
And Connie, it's important also that there's this almost like mathematical logic to it. I mean, there's 2 hands, they're making X's. He says 8 different ways in which you can make an X. The 2 hands corresponds to two screens. The 2 screens are presented in different configurations in 3 rooms. So there's there's a sort of as always in Bruce, there's an underlying structure to the work which is very precisely laid out, right?
And also his hands. I mean, hands have been a constant in his work from forever. And here again, even though, again, we don't know anything about Nauman from just looking at this, we do see that the hands are now not the hands of a 24-year-old anymore, like the body in Contrapposto studies. The hand has marks on it, age marks, and so forth.
And the story, there's always, Bruce provides a story that sometimes it might be.
I'm audible, can I interject something?
Yeah, please.
Rob.
Can I say something?
Please.
Connie?
Yes, Rob, please. Can you hear me? Oh dear. It seems to be frozen.
I think we're having an issue with Rob's mic, but I will reach out, try and get that connected.
Yeah, Rob, I didn't hear me, so he wasn't able to make his comment.
Rob, you might be seeing a pop-up on your screen.
There. Okay, can I speak now?
Yes, please.
Okay, because I may be taken out of this situation technologically in no time flat. So one of the things I just wanted to say is that 2 things I'm reminded of in this respect is that it's basically the 4 Children are piano pieces for children that Bartók composed, and they're finger exercises, they're elementary exercises, which is again a matter of going back to fundamentals. And then of course they're the pieces that he made with the slide guitarists who are super duper virtuosi on this instrument, and the motion of the hands in the slide guitar is very similar to the motion of his hands on the table. So there's all of these ways in which things just weave themselves together, and whether it's conscious on his part or not doesn't matter to me at all. It's very apparent in the work itself. He sees stuff. He sees it and he ponders it and he brings it forward.
Yes.
And he hears.
Oh, that's a good, yeah. You really get a feel for it here, I think.
And hands, are we have the cave paintings, the first cave paintings of hands, it's almost like it's the absolute first tool of the artist, right? So there's this return to absolute basics, In this case, they're making an X, it's something that is even beyond language, before language.
Next slide, please. And then the next. And this is what you were describing to me, Joan. This is in the elevator gallery?
Yes.
Yeah.
And given the fact that it's a vertical format, the others are built of 2 horizontal images. This gives you a very different relationship to the hands, the image, and the making. It feels much less abstract than the others.
In this one, Joan, it's almost like a window. You can enter in the space. The other ones, because of the 3D quality, they push you out. The hands are in your space.
But this one is 3D as well. That's what's so strange about it. Probably the most difficult one to take in of the 3 pairs is the previous slide of the 2 black and white ones. And in that one, you can, for some reason, see the 3D more distinctly, and it's also the most uncomfortable one in the whole show, uncomfortable of the 3 pairs. There's a bench in the middle, and you have to choose either to stay at either end of the space, they form a corridor around you, or to sit and face one way or the other, where you deny a view of one. If you do that, much more choice for the person who's in the gallery.
And there is sound, right? But it's sort of ambient sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's now 10:55, and I wonder if we should go to questions. What do you think, Eleanor?
And Connie, one thing to say quickly, is what Bruce has said he always provides this sort of like keys to the work, and he said in this particular case, of course, there's the sign treatise signed by Crowfoot and, with an X, but he also says that, after his wife died, Susan Rothenberg, he had to deal with all the lawyers and the state papers, and that he was asked to sign endless amount of papers. And
Right.
at some point he said to the lawyer, "Can I sign with an X?" And the lawyer said, "No, you are a literate person. You have to sign with your name." So he said, "Well, I am going to sign with an X." And so, this whole series comes out also of that place, which is a place of loss, of mourning, and rage.
Yes, that's so. Was all that happening before he developed this work, or while he was developing the work?
He said that it was after that, then he started doing the work. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Okay, does anybody want to add anything before we go to questions?
I was wondering if you wanted me to show the video.
Oh, yes, please do.
Sure.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was great to see.
Can I interject something very quickly?
Please.
When I did the Venice Biennale, I did a reader, and I asked all the artists who were participating to please recommend a writer or a text or something that they thought about, not as a theoretician, but as just a thing that jogged their mind. And Bruce sent the phrase "solitur ambulado," which is a Latin version of something that was supposedly said by Diogenes. And the translation roughly is by walking it is solved. And basically he was saying that one thinks differently when walking, and he spends a lot of time or has spent a lot of time walking around. Now that's no longer easy, I don't think, and I don't want to turn this too biographical, but he is dealing with an old body. So I then thought, oh my gosh, it's like AT&T, let the fingers do the walking. And I think in a way, he's able at this table to cover an enormous amount of ground and concentrate in the way that one associates with walking, but that doesn't actually require walking. And I don't know whether that's in any way descriptive of his state of mind, but it seems to me as I look at it that it's descriptive of what I think of when I watch him do it.
Thank you. That's interesting. Eleanor, are you there?
Yeah, we do. We have a bunch of amazing questions from the audience. So I think we will now turn to our Q&A. I would like to first ask Robert C. Morgan, if you would like to, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much. I found this work incredibly engaging, I have to say, particularly when I got up to the third floor and saw it in black and white. And I did get the stereoscope the feeling from it. But I'm also interested in the kind of irony that there is no evidence of the mark itself. There is only the movement of the hands across this remarkable table with many, many marks. And I see it as a kind of hard edge drawing that he is doing. I don't get the specificity of the X mark, but I get the overallness of the hard edge drawing, which I think is remarkable. It has significance because the mark is not there. That's my feeling about it.
One thing, Robert, I think that, thank you for your comment. One thing to add about the table, you know, the table is an old post office table.
I know that, yeah.
Yeah, that had been in Bruce's studio for a long time.
Right.
It reminds me of a poem by Antonio Machado, who says in Spanish, "Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar," you know, al andear se hace camino. You know, which means that there is no road, and the road is made by walking, right? Going back to what Rob said. But I think that there is also, you know, a profound sense of loss because the mark doesn't stay. You know, this is all about the mark that is not the mark. It doesn't stay. It's an evanescent. It's movement. It just goes away.
Well, the mark is not evident, but the movement of the hands replaces the mark. And that I find is significant.
Well, actually, can I add one more thing? When I was doing my homework, I looked it up, and the story of the Diogenes version of it is that somebody challenged Diogenes as to whether movement was real. And then he got up and walked, and that's what proved that movement was real.
Yes. He was a sophist discussing the nature of movement, and then Diogenes saying, you know, it is solved by walking.
That's exactly.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that question. I would now love to pass the mic over to GE. GE has a great question as well. GE, you should be able to unmute. Oh, I think you're still.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think that's it. In thinking about him, especially with the two pieces, the two shows we've seen today, with Duchamp and his mark, and of course others, is Nauman making his problems the viewer participants' problems? And in so doing, is it like a moment of the artist melding with all his others?
Who wants to take that on?
I think you're right. I think I realized I was muted before, but to go back to Robert Morgan's point, it's the opposite of something not being there. He's making something visible. In this film video, he's making his mark. It's not his mark, one defining mark. And the word mark can be a gesture. It doesn't have to be visible. It can be a drawing. It's the spark. We don't need to know the underlying story of where the X came from. He's used it in, rarely, but he used it in the sculpture installation, black marble under yellow light. But whatever it is, the catalyst for the idea, it's his, he's a gerund. He's making something and showing you how it's made, and he's letting you see mostly how he's made it, but not all of how he's made it. And in fact, this mark prompted him to think about other marks he was aware of. And as he said recently, he told me that he was often rereads Moby Dick, and he was remembering the mark that Queequeg made. And so he looked at the film and he saw, oh, this was an interesting film and how they did the eye. And then he went back to the book and the eye is not there. So he's ruminating on the meaning of what a mark does and what you see in it and how it's interpreted. And it's not necessarily one thing, but I see Nauman making his mark over and over again in whatever medium he uses. He is making something, and the process is as important as the final thing that's made, even though it's very important that the final thing that's made is correct to his thinking. He's very rigorous about that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now love to pass the mic over to Andrew Woolbright. Andrew, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the conversation. I just wanted to ask how Nauman's relationship to institutional critique has changed over the course of his life. Like if, as Robert said, his body is a ready-made that is trying to connect the history of sculpture to video work, and he's creating this slippage between studio space and gallery space. Is he still trying to do that? Is that antagonistic, or has his views changed over the course of his life?
I just will venture to say that I don't think institutional critique per se is of much concern to Bruce. He's done things that you can spin ideas around, and you've just done that, but I don't think his concern is institutional critique. I think he realizes that in different spaces, different things are likely to occur to you, and you can, concentrate differently. But he wants to bring something to your attention and then often take something away from you too.
It goes down to his often repeated mark, pay attention. Please pay attention, please pay attention, motherfuckers. Just whatever it is, pay attention every day, every moment, wherever you are.
Great. Thank you. I would now like to pass the mic over to Charlie. Charlie, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks, Connie and Robert and Carlos. This has been really wonderful to listen to. And hi, Francesca. It's good to see someone in Venice here. Joan, also, thanks for your comments. I also got to see the show His Mark, and I was interested in your experience of which artwork gave you the most discomfort, because I took a lot from reading Connie's book about Bruce's architectural installations. And one of the things that really stuck with me was how Bruce made an effort to get people to pay attention by creating situations where their body was somewhat unsettled, whether through discomfort or disorientation. But two things that struck me in your experience: one was how comforted you felt in some of the spaces. And I was curious if we could maybe try and put some particularities on what it was, or why the slowness and the vastness was comforting. And I also wanted to share a different experience, because I experienced the piece with the bench and the two walls differently. I laid down and kind of let the piece fill my peripheral vision, and spent a lot of time thinking about how that related to the types of corridors Bruce made that Connie wrote so thoughtfully about. And where I was really made discomforted, where I had to take my glasses off, was at the part of Speroni where you kind of stand on the edge and you look over. And of course, that's the second time, to kind of reiterate what Carlos was saying about the numerical structures that underlie a lot of our experiences. The second time you see that piece from a second perspective. And for me, that second perspective up on the balcony was, I had a vertigo type experience. I had to check myself, which is not something I often have an experience of with any piece of contemporary art. So I know I've said a lot, but I really wanted to share that. And Joan, I guess I wanted to ask you specifically if there was something you could say about feeling comforted. And then Carlos, I was curious if there's places in your work in Venice where the idea of making the viewer or the audience member unsettled was an active consideration.
I think the room that felt the most comforting was, or the one that felt comforting on its own, was the one with in the corner. And part of it had to do with the image coming out slowly and touching the walls, that it created, the movement of the 3D created a complete space. The other thing is, I don't know whether you believe in ghosts or not, but I can imagine that they exist, and it felt like a specter coming out of the walls. And it wasn't as, let's say, evident of what was upside down, reversed, as in the first room. And the most disturbing one for me was on the third floor, the two parallel ones. But I must say the most shocking element coming in was when you walked into the gallery, whether you had the glasses on or not, and I didn't, you saw straight ahead the second room framed like a painting, this incredible hand coming through. I still don't know why I found the black and white pair, which was like a corridor, so disturbing. It was the most three-dimensional, the most queasy making, but I think most of the time, I mean, all of the time, Bruce's rules are very specific, and you need to see it from a certain point of view, or even when you're manipulating nature morte, the rules are pretty much set up with a little bit of play in it. This one, you are caught in a kind of either or situation, which his work doesn't usually allow. If you look at one, your back is to the other. Now, he's often played with his own back. We've seen it in sculpture, we've seen it in photos. So you're aware of your back and what you're not seeing as much as what you are seeing. And if you try to take the two in, for some reason, it seemed the most traditional 3D. Also, it's pretty crazy to think, you know, from the most elemental level, you're taught sculpture is in 3 dimensions, and drawing and photographs are flat, and video images are basically flat on the wall or in a monitor. And here he's animating everything. So I still don't understand why that one was so uncomfortable for me.
Actually, in the one downstairs in the back, the hand sort of pushes up at you. It's almost like you have these enormous fists of Muhammad Ali come in your direction. That's very disconcerting, because he has a meaty hand, and it's really big in that context. And there's a kind of 3-point perspective effect of the camera. So there's a lot of, you're being pushed around by the image, even though it's not an aggressive act, I think, on his part per se.
You know, I'd also say about the third floor one with the two, it has in essence created a corridor. And many of Bruce's corridors that turn into rooms are very uncomfortable places, especially when they're triangular rooms. And I think we next need to see the iteration of the Tate show that was curated by Andrea Lozoni and Nick Sirota, because it's changed as it's gone to places. And when it goes to Hangar by Coca, it's going to be in such a vast space that is almost a corridor itself. And they're going to be emphasizing the corridor works in the same way that Carlos picked up and emphasized the sound and the sound absorbing works. I think the nuances of these two shows are tremendous. And they haven't erased other aspects. They put it in the context of the larger career, but I think each point of view is really important right now.
I had a very opposite feeling in the third floor with the black and white. It was the most relaxing for me.
Oh.
And I think it's because the color was sometimes a little jarring. And the black and white was very open, or had a kind of opening sensibility that I could enter into. And I could watch them both, and I could feel myself as being a part of the work. And I enjoyed that feeling.
Well, you know, that's something, much as I do not like watching Avatar, but I do like listening to what James Cameron has to say. And his point of view of why he's focused on 3D for so long is that our normal vision is stereoscopic, and that if, when both visions are together, it's the most satisfying and brain stimulating. So he said, if you go to a movie and you just see regular movie, you have 90% of the experience. But if you see it in 3D, you have 100% of that brain charging experience. I don't know. That's what he says.
Okay.
Are there more questions, Eleanor?
There is one more question.
Okay.
Then we will have our final closing remark from Fong. So our final question is, from Zoom user, we don't have a name on the account, but the question was about why Naumann's work is more embraced in Europe.
Is that true?
To unmute.
Oh, that's my question. That's my question. But I feel like the museums in Europe all have like Naumann's work is much more featured within the institutional context. And looking at the piece with the hand, it struck me that there's always something about immaterial in his work, and like almost like the memory of the, the kind of like memory that artists use with their hands to make something is just as important or as the actual work itself. And I think that goes to the haptic aspect of making work. But I was wondering whether that kind of, and even though video is obviously material, I was wondering whether that embrace of his work reflects the kind of aspect of materiality within the two cultures. And I was wondering whether all of you could, what your thoughts were, whether that's something that.
Let me just say
Does
something
anybody hear me?
simplified, is that, there are a lot of people who really don't like Bruce's work and who object to it more or less openly. For example, Arthur Danto was on a panel once and he just excoriated him and really did not like it. And there are a lot of people who don't like it because it is aggressive. That was Arthur's reason. But other people don't like it because it doesn't give itself to you easily. And I remember years and years and years ago, Lucy Depard wrote a very good essay on difficulty in contemporary art. And I think we've moved away from a point where difficulty is valued very much, unless it's valued ideologically. Playing hard to get ideologically is condoned, but actually presenting the experience of something that is truly not pre-digested is not something people are looking for, and not something that curators do very much. And I think, Bruce is an example of a guy who's just stuck to his guns by doing that. And some of his pieces actually are very pleasing. Many of them are not. But the point is that he's unafraid of whether or not people will cotton to what he wants you to pay attention to. He just presents it.
Well,
Yeah.
sorry. I thought Nauman brought together feeling and thinking. And he always has done that from my point of view. And I think that that combination is something that is not so familiar in the United States in terms of art, okay? That you feel it, maybe, depending on how you want to talk about feeling, but you don't see the other counterpart, which is the thinking component to that feeling. And Bruce's work has both. And therefore, it's much more, I think, European. And that's in fact where he had his breakthrough in Europe, if we remember historically. And I think that's why, because that aspect of how you address the work is definitely there.
Yeah. Do the other curators have the other?
Let me just interject a plug for my own show. The show that I did in Venice is called "Feel with the Senses, Think with the Senses, Feel with the Mind." And the dichotomy that Robert's talking about does exist in our culture in a more exaggerated form than many places, although it goes back to Descartes and many other people. But the point is that people have a hard time doing both, but they should aspire to do both. And artists like Bruce really require that they do both.
I think what you're saying is true, but I don't think it's as evident. For example, a work like South America Triangle may be experienced as very uncomfortable, torturous. You don't need to know that it was based on reading about actual torture in South America to get the expression. So what prompts, Bruce, is not written above the line, but it's sort of underneath. You can explore it, you can learn about it if you want to, but it's not crucial to experiencing the work. That sense of feeling and the content are simultaneously there, even if you don't know what the specific content is.
True enough.
Thank you so much. Did anybody else want to add anything, or?
See the show before it closes on March 12th at
Sunday.
Speroni.
Right.
Absolutely. Please do. I would now like to pass the mic over to our artistic director, the artistic director of the Book and Rail, Thong Bui.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Robert. This is amazing to talk about Bruce Nauman in general. I once talked to Richard Serra about the condition of the whole decade, the 80s, where both of them was not selling any works. And Richard basically said that Castelli was doing so well with Jasper John, with Roy Lichtenstein, and other artists. He can afford to keep support them, provide them the means to do their work the whole entire decade. I think Richard Serra did not sell any except for maybe 2 drawings, 1 small sculpture. And I think that probably applied to Nauman as well. But that's not why the resistance towards anything but the vision to do the work was so invested. But I think regarding to what you were talking earlier about the movement, the hand, Carlos, and Joan spoke, and Robert, and so did Connie. One of the things that I think as a younger, when I was a young artist, that struck me so much is almost what you just described, Robert. You can either fall in love with it or you really hated the work, because you can read either way. It's aggressive or it's very, very challenging. And one of the things that I noticed from the get-go was that he never took space for granted. Maybe the movement, the hand, everything else is part of it, but I remember being reminded just to see the show just briefly the other day, was that it's reminded me of Giacometti, hands holding the void, the object in the middle. And you feel that incredible activation of that negative space that he never really felt that it would be not there to experience, you know? And I think that that is something that you always felt consistently throughout the work. The other thing I want to ask, because you live in Paris for so long, Joan.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't remember reading in literature there were any reference made to Giacometti. I know that for Richard Serra, Giacometti was a huge deal. When he was in Paris after Yale, graduated from Yale, essentially spent the whole summer there and just followed Giacometti everywhere. Giacometti would go to Cate Poucault, he would go there and sat right like a distant. And I know that woman with her throat cut was a huge deal to Richard early on in recognizing the first sculpture that ever been put on the floor. You know, so I wonder whether anything similarly that happened to Nauman. I know that he came from a different tradition from the West Coast, but if any reference made to Giacometti at all?
Good question. Well, first of all, he spent very little time in Paris, unlike Richard, who was there for quite a while with Fulbright and all that. He was there, you know, for a show at Sonnabend, who introduced him to this great restaurant where there was a worm in the bottle of, I forget what the Mexican drink is called. But what is it? Yeah, mezcal. But he really, more than even being a West Coast artist, he's a Midwesterner. And I think to really understand his thinking and his experience, one goes back to that. And then choosing to go to school in Wisconsin, choosing to go to study in San Francisco with other artists like Frank Owen and many colleagues who participated in his early films. I think his world was reading and going to museums, but I don't think he was a big world traveler.
Mhm.
I think he studied art history. I think he studied music. He went wherever his curiosity took him.
Several
And,
years
and
ago,
I think also at a time of conceptual work, he valued sculptors who made things.
Yeah.
I would imagine him being interested in Giacometti, but definitely he wanted to recuperate an understanding of Henry Moore.
Yes, Henry Moore bound to fail.
So it were the problems of sculpture that he looked at and addressed and kept refining and changing. I mean, when he solved one, he went on to another. When you said in the 80s, I mean, people were shocked that he was making brash neons, this conceptualist performance artist, materials of, was working with professional actors,
Yeah.
you know, after the three that he had done earlier with Elka and Tony and Pursuit that had Franco in it, and he was in it as well. Working in color video, multiple monitors, I mean, sex, violence, death. I mean, he was entering a world that people were shocked that had been such a big, appeared to them such a big turn. But he had always dealt with life and death issues. He had always dealt with violence, but he also had always dealt with humor. He's a very funny, many of his pieces are very funny,
Yeah.
as well as generous and touching, as well as violent and scary. I mean, I think there's not such a big split between, although there has been a split between people who think his work is awful and that he's the greatest ever. So lots of room for everybody in between.
I mean, okay, is there any direct reference or indirect reference to structuralist film at all, Joan, Robert, or Carlos? I mean, when I think of, for example, Richard Serra early film, you know, he was very close to Michael Snow, whom then invited him and introduced him to the whole avant-garde community in the village, you know, and Jonas Makers and Hollis Frampton particularly. So I wonder if he was at all having a relationship with avant-garde cinema.
That's a question that's really West Coast. And I think Connie can very specifically answer that. He was involved with a number of filmmakers out there and artists who made films who weren't necessarily identified as filmmakers. But Connie, you know that. So
He participated in many of those early films, and with Frank Owen and others. And these were people that were his older than he was. They were people he knew when he was a student at Davis. And as I said, you know, film was just a way to make the work happen. I mean, I don't think he was so involved in film as film, but it was a way to do performance and so forth. And then when video became available, he sort of left film behind because video was more convenient. He could be 60 minutes rather than 10 minutes, which was the length of a film reel. And he could edit it and so forth and manipulate it in different ways. So that's what I think.
there were also, he said, very few venues available to perform. So by filming it in the studio and just setting up the camera as a neutral, static watcher, he could preserve the performances and actually do them.
Right.
That's true.
But I think the general thing is that he's not making work about other work in most cases. I mean, the Henry Moore Bound to Fail is a very specific example. I think he's making work about things that occur to him when he may have been triggered by something or had a question or whatever it is, but he's not an academic artist. He's not commenting on his times, so to speak, in terms of the aesthetic flux. He is going straight to the point so far as he sees it. Or if he can't go straight to the point, he's talking about his frustration in not being able to go straight to the point.
Also, he's talked about going into the studio every day and doing something and making something, and whether he had an idea that satisfied him or not. He just did it until he got an idea that interested him, and he didn't reject the ones
Or
that
not
weren't.
making anything. I mean, maybe going to the studio and reading.
Yeah.
Which is, I think we did a lot, just being in the studio.
Or then later using the things he rejected before and sticking them together in other works. I mean, it's observing his surrounding, his immediate, but it's a daily task.
Right, a ritual.
He's the master of boredom. He knows how to make work of being bored too. So, he covered it all, like John say. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Fang. Thank you for arranging this.
Well, yeah, I just want to thank Fang and the entire wonderful staff at Brooklyn Rail, Nick especially, who helped us enormously, and Eleanor, and all the people who work there who make this happen. I don't know how, every single day, just about. And thank you to Joan and to Rob and to Carlos, of course. It was just wonderful to have you. And I can't wait to see the shows.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the questions. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Bianca Stone, to the stage. Writer and visual artist Bianca Stone is the author of Someone Else's Wedding Vows, poetry comics from the Book of Hours, the Mobius Strip Club of Grief, and a children's book called A Little Pauline with text by Gertrude Stein. Her poems, poetry comics, and nonfiction have appeared in a variety of magazines, including the New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, American Poetry Review, and many others. She is the director of programs for the Ruth Stone House, a literary nonprofit artist residency, letterpress studio, and community poetry center in Vermont. Thank you for joining us, Bianca, and I will pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. It was really awesome to hear you guys just totally go deep on this artist who is new to me. I am just going to read one very tiny poem called The Way Things Were Up Until Now. I'm bored of all the excuses, bored as Mayakovsky at the Finnish painter's exhibition, barking like a dog through the foreign minister's toast until he cried and sat down. Deadly serious. I am bored as an elegy. I mean, why care at all, speaking as a pitfall in a world of pits? But we do, to the death. We all agree to garden this year. And my raspberry bushes picked over by wrens, I'll make them great again and let America go wild. It'll be all trumpets and leeks and lilacs from here on out. Let's stop paying for it, get it free. Let's plant our victory gardens to supplement grief, boost morale, as though something new and uncontrolled were available. It is the original, new, hot, future joy. And we're making it out of dough. And the illusion of separateness, let it go back into remission. Just look at you. You look like a resurrected child, a serious drama in a cosmic joke, scarred, masked, dangerous. And what of the new Eucharist? How hungry I always am, how I long to lack, though in Walmart, my heart beats a little faster, and I want the world to heal up. And the world is a field, as if it were indeed flat, curving and caving, as if it were a piece of paper, a Gustave Doré engraving from the Divina Commedia, the one with the silhouettes of Dante and Beatrice standing in front of the blinding, exploding white rose that you realize when looking more closely is all made up of bodies and wings twisting together. The saintly throng, they call it, mashed and hurtling, an image of heaven and the creation of angels, though it is frenzied as any image of hell around a divine nipple, Odin's lost eye in the well, the drain to the other side, joy that gets more frantic the more you try to quiet it down. Thank you guys. I'm honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. That was amazing. Everybody definitely make sure to check out Bianca's work in the March issue of The Rail, which will be coming out this week in the next few days. That's very exciting. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We encourage you all to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, and we will upload this conversation there shortly. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 76th Radical Poetry reading featuring Hallie Lisa Gaffori, Holly Melgard, and Leonard Schwartz for the first of a 2-day celebration with Gaffori's new translation of poems by Rumi. So please you can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye and hello as you leave. Thank you everyone for a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
so
much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joan.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thank you,
Rob.
Connie.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Carlos.
Carlos.
Thanks, Carlos.
Thanks,
Hello,
Connie. Thanks,
Connie.
Robert.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Robert.
Joan.
Connie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thank you, Bob.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Bianca.
Thank
Thank you, Bianca.
Great reading, Bianca. Can't wait to read the poems in the March issue.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it like always. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Joe.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you all.
Be coming to New York, Joan.
Me?
Yeah,
Thursday,
Thursday. Great.
the day after tomorrow. We'll talk.
We'll talk. Much
Okay.
Safe
love.
travels,
Thank
Connie.
you, Connie. Thank you, Joan.
Have to
Thank you,
Thank
Joan.
you, Robert. I'll be seeing you
Thank you,
tonight,
everyone.
Robert.
I'll see you tonight.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Nick, thank
Much
you.
love. Bye.
Thank you all.